All right, we're going to be talking about the effectiveness of international sanctions because, as active citizens, as voters, you hear politicians of both parties talk about sanctions. And my point in this presentation is that politicians of both parties talk about sanctions. It's a buzzword in democratic diplomacy. It's not just the United States. You'll hear all liberal Western democracies will talk about economic sanctions. You never hear autocratic, oligarchical, communist dictatorships, absolute monarchies. They never talk about economic sanctions. It's only the liberal Western democracies led by the United States that talk about economic sanctions because they're trying to say something to look tough. You know, it's the first step. Anytime a country crosses the United States, we label them a rogue state. And we're going to put sanctions on you to make you behave. The problem is they don't work. When politicians use the term sanctions or embargoes, what they are doing is they are trying to get your vote. They are trying to get you to think that they are doing something, but they don't work. You know, there's this thing called real politics. It's a theory by Bismarck and Clausewitz, and then there's democratic peace theory and all kinds of things. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's hard politics and soft politics. Hard politics is bomb them, okay? Bombing countries works in the short term, okay? You can make a country do something in the short term by going to war with them. Soft politics, soft power works as well. It's harder to see and it sounds weak. The problem is that when we talked about incentives, right? I said incentives is us helping a country, giving a country something. If a country hurts the United States and the president of the United States says, you know what, I'm going to give them trade concessions and give them some incentives to help them behave better. That sounds bad to a voter. Afghanistan was harboring terrorists that bombed the United States on September 11, 2001. If President Bush had said, well, we really need to deal with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, so therefore I'm going to invite the Taliban to trade with us and we'll invest in Afghanistan economically so that they know how to behave in the international system. George Bush would have been laughed out of office in 2004. But so that's why he didn't do that. What did he do? He invaded within 30 days and we've been in Afghanistan ever since. Your entire life we've been in Afghanistan because it sounds tough to bomb a country. Sanctions are a way to not have to go to war, but to sound like you're doing something, and they don't work. The countries that we have sanctioned into compliance, allegedly, Cuba, South Africa, Libya, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, okay? We have sanctioned every single one of those countries. And today's presentation, I'll try to point out that it has been an abysmal failure. We have sanctioned Cuba for 11 or 12 presidents now. Does Cuba do what we want now? We have sanctioned North Korea for 50, 60 years. Does North Korea do what we want? We've sanctioned Iran for 30 years now. Does Iran do what we want? And if you think about Iraq, we sanctioned Iraq. It never worked. When did Iraq start doing what we wanted? When we invaded Iraq. And you need to know that it's a way for politicians to manipulate you. We're going to go looking at a little bit of a history of economic sanctions. And in each one of these cases, I want you to see how they failed. And yet you have never been taught this side of history. Prior to World War II, we didn't like the fact that the Japanese Empire was starting to get pretty aggressive in the Pacific region. They were invading China. They had actually just prior to the World War II starting with the United States, they had invaded Singapore and started World War II with the British and the French. They had invaded the French colonies of Indochina. We were looking at this, what we considered to be an aggressive government. And so we, in 1938, put a voluntary ban on trade. Oh, that'll get them to stop. And then in 1940, we put a mandatory, we're serious. We're going to mandatorily ban war materials. Okay? 1940, later in the year, we banned oil to Japan. And in 1941, look at the date, July 25th, 1941, we froze all Japanese assets in the United States. We stole their money. In July, we stole their money. What happened in December 1941? Pearl Harbor, Japan bombed the United States. And everybody in the United States said, oh my goodness, I can't believe Japan bombed us. What a surprise. Pearl Harbor was a surprise. Why is it a surprise? We had put a ban on their war materials. We banned sales of oil to them, and we stole their money. And then they bombed us. And we were like, what? Why would they do that? The bombing of Pearl Harbor was a direct response to what we did. We started the fire, as Billy Joel said. It's been always burning. The world's been burning. So that's my point, is that the economic sanctions we put in place to try to get Japan to behave, not only did they not make Japan behave, it made Japan bomb us. How effed up is that? What I'm talking about right now is not Democrats versus Republicans. And I'll just, in my area of research, there are Democrats and Republicans, and we all agree. We know what this does and doesn't do. Here's a well-known Republican, Bruce Bartlett. He worked for Ronald Reagan and for H.W. Bush. And the use of sanctions against North Korea and Vietnam. We sanctioned China for supporting North Korea from 49 to 70. Didn't stop China from supporting North Korea. They're still supporting North Korea today in 2020. From 1954 to 1994, we sanctioned Vietnam. And during that, we even bombed Vietnam and had the Vietnam conflict, right? Guess what? It's 2020. Vietnam's still a communist country. All those sanctions, all that wasted effort, all that loss of money or trade, and it didn't work. And yet, we talk about this as this sanctions are this panacea that fixes everything. You know, I hear, well, they kind of worked in Cuba because, look, Cuba's starting to reform. Oh, they worked in South Africa. Oh, they worked in Libya too. Think about it this way, okay? If you're a parent and you want to get your kid to do something, well, I'm going to take away their dinner. They can't have their supper until they apologize for poking their brother in the eye. Okay. All right, so it's 5 o'clock. You've now decided you're not going to give food to your child. 6 o'clock. Still haven't fed your kid. 7 o'clock. Haven't fed your kid. 8 o'clock. 9 o'clock. 10 o'clock. Be a tough parent. Make them go to sleep. Sleep the whole night. They're going to wake up hungry. That'll show them. That'll teach them. 6 o'clock in the morning. 7 o'clock in the morning. The kid gets up. Kid's hungry. Okay? The kid then apologizes for poking their brother in the eyeball. Is that kid sorry? That kid's not sorry. That kid's hungry. So my question is, how long are you going to put sanctions on a country and then claim credit for it? Okay? That's what I want you to consider in this segment. I want you to think about Cuba. The sanctions against Cuba started with President Eisenhower.
1.
Kennedy.
2.
LBJ.
3.
Nixon.
4.
Ford.
5.
Carter.
6.
Reagan.
7.
Bush.
8.
Clinton.
9.
Bush.
10.
Obama.
11.
11 presidents. 11 presidents, most of whom served 8 years, with the exception of Kennedy, Carter, and H.W. The sanctions started when my dad was in college. My dad is 78 years old. Oh, but by the way, Cuba's reforming now. It must have worked. Clearly, our sanctions worked. Okay? From 58 to 16, we sanctioned Cuba, which, by the way, is against international law. So when you hear then politicians say, well, these countries aren't following international law, we don't follow international law. Okay? Not only did the sanctions not work against Cuba, but one of the many reasons they didn't work is because we were the only country sanctioning them. Germany is one of our best friends, and they said, hey, that's really funny. Please keep sanctioning them. This is great. because then Germany started trading with Cuba and making money off of Cuba. Cuba's off the coast of Florida. Who should be making money off of Cuba? We should be. But Germany was making money off of Cuba because our presidents of both parties were like, oh, we're going to sanction them. They're going to be sorry. They're going to be hungry, and they're going to apologize for poking their brother's eye really hard. They'll understand. They'll learn their lesson. South Africa. In 1960, if you don't know about this, this is again an example of history that's not taught. Look up the Sharpeville Massacre. It's one of the worst events in international history. Okay. In 1960, the apartheid government of white South Africa initiated the Sharpeville Massacre. Okay. This is the apartheid government that was very similar to the American Jim Crow era, right? The segregation of people based on this taxonomy of skin color. In 62, the General Assembly condemned apartheid. What you're doing is bad. Stop doing it. The next year, you didn't stop doing it. The next year, the Security Council gave an optional voluntary arms embargo. Yeah, that's right. Optional voluntary arms embargo. That'll show them. 13 years later, they made the arms embargo mandatory. What? You mean a voluntary arms embargo for 13 years didn't work? Mandela got the attention of the American people in a way that forced the US government to start doing something, but the US government wasn't ready to do anything that would work. So we sanctioned South Africa. We took their dinner away. We said, you're not allowed to trade with us anymore. We're the most powerful country in the world. We're not gonna trade with you. Who cares? In the example of Cuba, I already showed that other countries will step in and fill that gap and trade with countries. That's what China does with North Korea, okay? The other thing, if you think about it, is a sanctioned country, you actually are helping that bad regime. You're helping the dictators, because then they can say, oh, the bad United States, the evil great white Satan, the United States is against us. You actually help the bad people when you sanction countries. You also, if you think about it, you make them self-sufficient. Google Cuban cars. In Cuba today, in 2020, people are driving cars that were made in the United States over 100 years ago. And you know what? The cars work. How many of you own a 1920 Buick? Nobody. Because they don't work. There's no working 1920 Buicks in the United States. And if they do work, it's because somebody spent a lot of money. But in Cuba, they still have these 1920 Buicks working because we made them self-sufficient. We forced them by necessity to be really good at fixing old cars. Okay. When Mandela was freed, finally, think about it. He was not freed by US Special Forces. He was freed by white, racist South Africans. The bad guys are the ones that ultimately decided to free him, not the good guys making the bad guys do it. That if you read the book written by the guy who released Mandela from jail, the guy's name is F.W. de Klerk, he talks about how the sanctions helped him. He talks about how he was able to use the United States as a bad guy to help his own re-election bids. What actually changed the white South Africans' mind was the white South Africans got to the point where they realized it was wrong. In the case of South Africa, I want you to think about it again, like Vietnam and like Cuba, the sanctions were in place for years, from 1960, the you shouldn't do that starts, all the way through 1994. So for you to say that the sanctions worked, that means anybody who tells you, any politician or history teacher or what have you, who tells you that the sanctions worked in South Africa, what that person is actually telling you is that from 1960 to 1994, in those 34 years, that every black man who was beaten, every black man who was killed, every white woman who lost her child, her husband was raped, every black child who didn't get an education, that was all okay because 34 years later, one guy got out of jail. And in Libya, they say sanctions worked in Libya. Didn't work in Libya's case either. There used to be this guy, Muammar Gaddafi, was the dictator of Libya for years and years and years. In 1992, he did something to help Iran, and it really ticked off the United States. In fact, the United States collected evidence that showed that the Libyan government had two operatives that put a bomb on a plane that was filled with Americans and Brits that took off from England, flew over Scotland, particularly a town called Lockerbie, Scotland. And over the air of Lockerbie, Scotland, the bomb went off, everybody was killed, and the plane fell to the ground, and all those hundreds of Americans and Brits killed, as well as other nationals. So in March of '82, we start putting sanctions on Libya. They killed Americans. They killed Americans, and our response was, you can't have your dinner until you apologize.
Hello.
Okay? We didn't lift the sanctions until Libya did eventually apologize in 2006. So again, same thing, '82 to 2006. Does that mean those 20 plus years of sanctions, they worked? 20 plus years of Libya being against the United States was all okay and worthwhile? I don't think so. I don't think that Libya just in 2006 said, oh, yeah, let's do the right thing. The reason they apologized in 2006, they had actually started apologizing because on January 29th, 2002, President George W. Bush gave a very famous speech. It's called the Axis of Evil speech, in which he indicated that these three countries, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, were enemies number one of the United States, and we were going to take care of it. And think about that. We then invade Iraq in 2003. So when we invade Iraq, what that said to Libya was, instead of just sanctioning us and telling us we can't have our dinner, they're actually going to bomb us like they did to Afghanistan, like they did to Iraq. And that's what made Libya and Muammar Gaddafi start to apologize and negotiate how can they get on the good list. Okay? That's what really triggered it. And I'm not trying to sound like a war hawk. I'm not trying to say that war works or is the best option, but I am saying that it works better than the sanctions. I still believe that incentives work better than anything else. The problem with the way that sanctions work, and I was going to discuss this later, but there's sanctions are, we refuse to trade with you as a country, okay? Does anybody think that Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, does anybody think he's hungry? Does anybody think the Ayatollah of Iran is hungry? You're going to tell me that Vladimir Putin has learned his lesson for all of the sanctions that Obama and Trump put on him, and that he's probably really cold and the heater's not working in his palace in Moscow, right? So when you sanction a country, you're hurting the people, not the leaders. So sanctions can work, but they have to be targeted sanctions. The sanctions should be targeted against the people who are in decision-making power and not the average person. Because if you hurt the average person in a country that we don't like, you're actually strengthening the bad guys. So, for example, we have sanctioned North Korea over and over and over again. In particular, we ban the shipment of rice periodically to North Korea. The North Korean government hurt their own people, and so to get them to feel bad for hurting their people, we're going to cut off rice supplements to the North Korean people and hurt the North Korean people. I mean, it's brilliant if you think about it. That'll teach the North Korean government not to hurt their people by hurting their people. Guys, I think I've been wrong about this whole thing. End of class. So we had this really much hyped up 1994 agreement with North Korea where they were going to promise that they were not going to develop nuclear weapons. And in exchange, we started giving them free rice. That didn't work either. Because the problem is that North Korea doesn't need us. So whether we give them rice or take rice away, it's the same thing to them. While I said that incentives work and giving rice is an incentive, the problem is it's giving rice to a country that's already self-sufficient from us. They're getting rice from China. You have to have an integrated economy to then incentivize. We don't buy anything from North Korea. So giving or taking rice doesn't matter, as I said. If we said, we will give you rice and we will buy North Korean army boots, now they have a stake in our economy because they're selling us army boots. Then they're going to do what we want. But playing these stupid black and white games just don't work. Look at how Kim Jong-un had played Donald Trump over the last 3 years. Oh, if I'll do what you want if you meet with me. Trump met with him twice. Great. Is Kim Jong-un doing what we want now? Of course not. Like the fact that the German government undermines the American sanctions in Cuba, China continuously undermines the North Korean sanctions. Yes, South Korea and Japan support the US sanctions, but China doesn't. Sanctions are only as good as the number of countries that agree to do them. And there's always somebody who's not going to agree. In the case of South Africa, it was Israel. In the case of South Africa, it was Israel that undermined the sanctions, among other countries, including, I think, also the Russians. In the case of Cuba, it was the Germans. In the case of North Korea, it's the Chinese. So there's always going to be a country that undermines it. That's like arresting all the gangs. I'm going to be tough on crime. I'm going to arrest all the gang leaders. I'm going to stop illegal drugs on the streets of America because I'm going to put every drug dealer in jail. If you put every drug dealer in jail, what happens? A new drug dealer shows up and becomes really rich because you just took out his competition. So one of the problems in Mexico is we've gone after Mexican cartels. Every time we go after a Mexican cartel, all we're doing is strengthening the other Mexican cartels because we're knocking out their competition. You need to take the right approach, not these soundbite approaches. The Kim family lives like kings in North Korea while the people of North Korea die. The sanctions did not work in North Korea. They didn't work because, again, China's the weak link. The point is, they don't work. I mean, there's just example after example. Iran, right? The sanctions in Iran, the Iranian hostage crisis, that because the Ayatollah took over the American embassy, that we were going to sanction Iran. The government of Iran in 2020 is the same government that was created in 1979 that took the Americans hostage. We haven't done anything. And guess which country undermined the Iranian sanctions in this case? It wasn't the Germans. It wasn't the Chinese. It wasn't the Israelis. The country that undermined the Iranian sanctions was the United States of America. We undermined our own sanctions. There's a whole book on it. It's called the Iran-Contra scandal. Google it. President Reagan undermined his own sanctions. Sanctions don't work. They didn't work in Iraq either. In 1990, we sanctioned Saddam Hussein for the invasion of Kuwait. We sanctioned them from 1990 to 2003. Saddam Hussein didn't go hungry. But you know who did suffer? The people of Iraq. Sanctions are a form of violence against civilian populations. They actually estimate that in Iraq, during the sanctions, in that period between Bush 41, Clinton, and the early Bush 43, they estimated that over 1 million Iraqi children died of dirty water. Because when we sanctioned them, we prevented them from buying the equipment that they needed to maintain their water treatment processing centers. Iraqi children died because of the United States of America. And Secretary of State of the United States of America, in an interview on 60 Minutes, said, well, the price is worth it. In what world is the death of 1 million children worth it? Especially when it didn't work. Saddam Hussein didn't lose power until he was invaded and removed from power. If you look at the countries that the United States has sanctioned over the years, it's the globe. You know what that makes it look like? First of all, it makes us look like a bully. And secondly, if you're sanctioning everybody, how can you say that that's an effective foreign policy when these countries don't respond to the sanctioning? There is a false dichotomy between war and sanctions, like I said. I don't believe war is the correct first choice option. Perhaps it's necessary at sometimes, but it doesn't mean that sanctions are right. There's a better way. And again, I said that smart Democrats and smart Republicans all know this already. Dick Lugar, one of the best Republican senators this country has ever had, he knew that sanctions don't work. Okay? Why don't we listen to the people who know? Why don't we listen to Courtwright? David Courtwright teaches at Notre Dame. Okay? He wrote the book, literally, on targeted sanctions. That you can have targeted sanctions that will hurt countries if you target the leaders and not the people. Why is it that a country that's being sanctioned by the United States, that their diplomats' children are in Disney World? Right? And I'm being serious right now. When you sanction a country, what you should do is target sanction the leaders and the families of the leaders. Ban the rich people from the world of going to Disneyland with their children. And guess what? Their children are going to be ticked off at mom and dad. How come I can't go to Disney World? And the mom and dad has to explain, I'm sorry, we can't go to Disney World because I do a job that the United States government doesn't like. And then that kid is going to say what? Well, why don't you stop doing that thing the United States doesn't like? Because I want to go to Disney World. We know the names of the leaders of every country. We know the names of their ministers, their secretaries, their government officials. We have huge lists. We need to use those lists. And finally, some of this is taking effect. Bush 2, Obama did start using targeted sanctions. Okay, so it's possible. We also call these smart sanctions. The problems that with sanctions, the way they have been used, are consistency. Okay, the United States isn't consistent. We complain other countries break international law, and then we break international law. There's also not consistency in the case that there's always another country that's going to fill that gap. There's always another drug dealer that's going to show up on the corner. Okay, there's the legality that sanctions are illegal unless they're implemented by the United Nations. So you can't have unilateral sanctions. You should have multilateral sanctions if you're going to have them. And then there's the ethical issue of, are the people being hurt? Are children, are a million Iraqi children dying in 10 years? And you have the audacity to go in 60 Minutes and say it's worth it. So the point, again, is that economic sanctions are a buzzword. It's a buzzword used by weak-minded politicians. So tell the politicians you're not an idiot and that you don't want economic sanctions. You want smart sanctions or targeted sanctions. Because this whole idea of using sanctions as a weapon of choice, it's political buzzwords, and it doesn't work.